Hello, my name is Kathleen Redman. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Programs at Affirmations Community Center, which is located in Ferndale, Michigan. We serve the broader Southeastern Michigan area. And one of the many things that we do at Affirmations is various trainings and educational opportunities for groups, businesses, and individuals in our community to make sure that they feel like they have a foundational knowledge of what the unique needs of the LGBTQ plus community are, give them a solid foundation. And so this 101 training is really meant to be a baseline. It will not cover everything. There will be a lot of material and probably some questions afterwards, but the intention is to give you a starting point so that you have a good baseline of information and know what questions you have and know where to seek other resources. So to that end, we'll be talking about LGBTQ plus 101 and inclusion. So today we're going to go over some common language and understanding. That's basic terms and definitions. We'll talk about what coming out means. Intersectionality is an important topic on this subject because none of us are only one of our identities, and the LGBTQ plus 101 or LGBTQ plus community is no different. So it's important we talk about that. We'll go over some of the challenges that our community can face, and then what allyship and inclusive language can look like. So if you're trying to be an ally, whether you're within the community or outside of the community, you have some action steps or some ideas of what that could look like. So I like to start with just some basic information about how many people openly identify as LGBTQ plus, ages 13 and up. This is a resource from the Movement Advancement Project that collects this information. And this is obviously a map of the United States and where those populations exist. I will say that this is a conservative estimate because of the nature of generally a lack of inclusion or safety or perceived lack of safety that many members of our community face. Not everyone who identifies as LGBTQ plus is going to be willing to be open about that and share that information in the survey. There are also a lot of folks who are still figuring out their identities and whether or not they are part of this community and want to share that information, in part because of existing stigma and discrimination that they could face due to their identities. So if we're looking at the state of Michigan, you'll see it's in the 200,000 to 499,000 range. I've seen estimates above 300,000 for the number of adults who openly identify as LGBTQ plus who live in the state of Michigan. So again, that only includes adults, which means there are also plenty of youth who identify as LGBTQ plus. And I would say in general, it's a conservative estimate, but that'll give you an idea that we are not an insignificant percentage of the population. We are your neighbors, we're your coworkers, your friends, the people you share a grocery store with. And whether or not you know our identities does not mean that we are not there and that it's not important for you to understand how to be supportive and inclusive of us because we are part of this community as well. So moving to the developing common language and understanding section, I hope this will give you a good foundation of what are some common terms and what are some basic things that you need to know about the community in order to be supportive. So I always like to start with talking about the differences between sex and gender. More often than not, we lump them together. And certainly there is a lot of overlap between the two terms, but there are also quite a few differences. And especially when we're thinking about the LGBTQ plus population, these distinctions are really important to understand because it's a foundation for someone's identity and how they express that identity. And being certain or having at least a clearer perception of what this means can help you be more supportive. So in this context, when I'm talking about sex, I talk about the biological characteristics that are assigned to someone based on their body type, chromosomes, and other biological factors that appear at birth. So you'll notice that I use the term assigned to, and that's a common way of framing it within the LGBTQ plus community, with the understanding that not everyone feels alignment between what's on their birth certificate and who they are. So because they don't have a decision when they're born about what terminology people use, and they haven't had a chance to form their own identity, we use the term assigned to indicate that it is not something that that person chooses for themselves when they are born, but rather something that physicians, parents, guardians, others who are in that space make that determination and put that information on a birth certificate. This is also the term that you will see most often in official legal documents, government documents. More often than not, it will ask for sex instead of gender. And certainly that can include a lot of folks, but isn't fully inclusive and representational. So it's important to understand that, yes, this is an important factor in someone's identity, but we're specifically thinking about biology rather than how someone sees themselves in their brain. So the two most common terms we'll use for sex are male and female. Those have traditionally been the only options in the US context in legal documents and forms, but they are not the only ones. So another important term to understand is intersex, which is another sex assigned at birth. And it's one that we don't talk about much. We consider intersex folks as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And what that essentially means is someone is born with what some might describe as ambiguous genitalia, body type, chromosomes, a combination of all of those. So a child is born and it may not be 100% clear what sex, whether male or female, that person would be. So then they might define that individual as intersex. In the past, they would typically make a determination and say, I want this child to be male or I want this child to be female. And so they would, rather than say intersex on those birth certificates, they would say, oh, this child is a male because I want them to be a male, or in my mind, this body type looks more male. But that can be problematic if that's not how that person identifies as they age. And especially in the past, they would perform surgeries in order to align that physical body with the determination that they made based on their own preferences. And so if you are a child who was born intersex, but assigned male on your birth certificate, and they performed a surgery to your body in order to create some alignment there, as you age, you may not feel that alignment. And then you have to grapple with knowing that your body was modified and not according to your own vision of who you are and how you want to live your life, but a decision made before you had the option of being involved. And so there are a lot of challenges that intersex people can face that other members of our community may not face. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this community, but I would encourage you to look for some more resources if this is something you'd like more information about. But the main takeaway is that sex in this context is talking about biology, your physical body, chromosomes, things of that nature. And there are three sexes that can be assigned at birth: male, female, and intersex. So next I want to talk about gender, which I'm defining as a person's perception of who they are as a person, and it's something that they define for themselves. So I've heard it framed before as sex is about body and gender is about brain. Certainly that's not 100% accurate, because there is a lot of overlap between your body and your brain and all the connections, how you express your gender, which is another important distinction. But when we think about gender, we need to think about how someone defines themselves, the terms they use, the way they express that, how they see themselves in their minds. And there's not always alignment between the sex that you were assigned at birth and your gender identity. And we'll talk about that more going forward. In Western societies, we have traditionally thought of this as a binary option of genders, man and woman, aligned with male and female sex. And now we're seeing more and more, though this has always been the case, that there's more than just two options and more than two ways that people can identify and express themselves. And I specifically mentioned Western society as in the United States context, because there are many other cultures around the world and in the Americas that have traditionally had a broader understanding of what gender means and what different identities people can hold. So for example, many Indigenous and Native communities have always had two-spirit individuals who transcend gender, whose gender identity is beyond a man-woman understanding, and it reflects aspects of gender, sexual orientation, role in society, skills. It's much more expansive than strictly thinking about someone's expression of their gender or their gender identity in a binary context. So I mentioned that to say that not everyone has always seen gender in a binary. Many folks have seen it as more expansive than that. And the rest of us are sort of catching up and learning and trying to make sure that we have a better understanding of what that can mean for folks. So what's important to understand about gender then is that it is a spectrum. There's a lot of different ways that people can identify within that spectrum or those spectrums. And the way they identify is not easily defined and can change over time. We're always learning and growing. And certainly when you take the perspective of the stigma and discrimination around different gender identities, it can take some time for someone to realize who they can be and how they can express themselves, that it's safe to do so. And in many contexts, it's not safe to represent yourself accurately. And you can change how you identify over time. For many folks, that's the reality on a daily basis because they define who they are. And if that shifts, then that's fine. But so you're never going to fully understand someone's own gender identity and how they see themselves. You can only understand what they are willing to share with you, the terms that they use to define themselves, and the way that they choose to express that. So the important thing is to remember that it is a spectrum. There are infinite ways that someone can identify and express their gender, and that may or may not align with their sex assigned at birth. And that just depends on the individual. So I also want to make sure we understand the difference between gender expression and gender identity. We can share the same terminology that we might use to define our gender identity. For example, I identify as a woman. So that doesn't mean that I represent my gender the same way that someone else who also identifies as a woman would represent her gender or their gender. So expression and identity are connected, but distinct at the same time. So just because someone looks a certain way in our minds based on our own preconceived notions of what womanhood or manhood or personhood looks like, doesn't mean that that's how they define themselves or how they would choose to express that gender. So now I want to talk about some of the most common gender identities you might encounter. This is in no way an exhaustive list. There are many, many more gender identities out there. Some of these on this list would be considered an umbrella term. So they might represent a larger understanding of a certain type of experience, but there are many different ways that people can fit within that umbrella, but use different terminology or have a different unique experience. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Starting from the top is cisgender. So that is the term that most of the population, sorry, my lights are shutting off. Most of the population would use to describe themselves. And that means that there is alignment between the sex that you were assigned at birth and your gender identity. So for example, I am a cisgender woman. I was born female, assigned female at birth, and I identify as a woman. So there is alignment there. So again, that's going to be the majority of the population. If we're talking about privilege, that is the more privileged identity within the LGBTQ plus community, because that is sort of the expectation of society, and the way society is structured is based around cisgenderism. Transgender, on the other hand, refers to somebody whose gender identity does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. That can mean a lot of different things to different people. This is one of those terms that's an umbrella term. Not everyone would use the word transgender to describe themselves or their experience, but they may have a similar feeling about a misalignment between what they were assigned at birth and who they are as a person and how they identify themselves. So again, transgender refers to a difference between sex assigned at birth and gender identity. And the last one on the list, non-binary, is another umbrella term that has many other specific terminologies people can use, and there are nuanced differences between them. But the basic definition is somebody who does not fit into a binary, as in two options, understanding of gender identity. So they wouldn't feel aligned with just being a man or just being a woman. They might feel connection to both. They might feel connection to neither. It could depend on the day or their mood, how they're feeling inside. And so there's a lot of variation in what non-binary can look like, and many terms that people use to describe a similar experience, though it's important to understand that there are important nuanced differences between all the terms people use, and they don't come to those terms and identities accidentally. And it can take some time to find one that fits best, especially as we learn more and as we're creating new language within our community to describe our experiences, because historically there haven't been many options. So we're in many cases creating that language as we're learning about who we are and who each other is, and those experiences can be very different. And so it can shift over time. But these are some general definitions for the most common gender identities you might encounter out in the world. But just remember, there are many, many more. If you're interested in learning about the other ones, feel free to do some research on your own. As always with online research, be careful with your sources. Not all are going to be completely accurate, but if you go to some trusted resources or organizations that strive to be supportive of our community, or if somebody shares about their own personal experience, those are generally the best resources for trying to understand what identities people can hold and what they mean. Transitioning is an important term to understand. It's typically used to describe people who identify as transgender or non-binary, fit within either of those umbrellas in some capacity. And transitioning refers to the process of creating alignment between your social life and your physical body with how you identify who you see yourself as inside your brain and your heart and your soul. So creating an alignment that wasn't previously there. And it's a really unique experience. It varies by individual. So there's no one way to transition. It can be social, it can be medical, it can be both. And that can mean a lot of different things to different people. So the main thing to understand is it's an individual journey. So if you hear someone's transitioning, that doesn't mean you know what that looks like for them or how that might change over time. So what a social transition can look like is changing your name, changing the pronouns that you use, changing the clothes that you wear, the way you style your hair, other sort of outward, more social related expressions of your gender identity. And medical transitioning refers to the process of either taking hormones like testosterone, for example, to help your body align with your gender identity. Or it can involve surgeries that can, for example, you could have breast reduction or removal surgeries. You could have facial restructuring surgeries. There are a lot of different surgical options and chemical medical options for people to transition. And again, that really depends on the individual. There are trans individuals, people who identify as transgender or having that lived experience, who choose not to transition at all. That's just how they identify themselves, and that's perfectly fine. And there are people who go through a complete social and medical transition, some of whom may no longer use the term transgender to refer to themselves once they feel satisfied with their journey and where they're at. And there's everywhere in between. So not everyone will transition. Some will do a complete transition, and some will do some combination, but it's always going to be an individual journey, and all versions of transitioning or not transitioning are completely acceptable. So if you're trying to be an ally, the important thing to remember is to just listen and trust and believe, and avoid asking invasive questions about what does your genitalia look like, which is always a weird thing to ask somebody. I can't think of a context where I would ask that. So you wouldn't ask that to a trans person or a non-binary person or someone who's going through any kind of transition. So just remember, don't let your curiosity get ahead of you, and let that lead. Trust the person and what they want to share about their own journey, and leave it at that. If they want to share more and tell you more because they trust you and you have that kind of relationship, that's great. But if it's just a stranger, just continue to mind your business and not worry about who they are or what their journey is, unless they're looking for help. So I've mentioned my pronouns when I started this training. I've mentioned them a couple of times since. So it's important that we go through what pronouns are and why they are important. So pronouns are a part of speech that most of us learn when we're young in school, and we don't really think about once we've integrated it fully into our speech patterns. We use it often without noticing that we're using pronouns, and it simply means a word that substitutes a noun. So the most common ones we'll hear are she, her, and hers, he, him, and his, they, them, and theirs, etc. So those are the most common ones. And typically those have some connection to the sex that people are assigned with birth and gender. So that's why that comes up in this context of thinking about the LGBTQ plus community, is because there's so much connection between the pronouns we use for someone and their gender. And so if we're trying to be inclusive and supportive, it's important that we understand what pronouns people would like us to use for them. And if they're transitioning, especially, in order to be supportive of that process, we really need to use the terms that people want for themselves, and that includes pronouns. So we typically make assumptions about someone's pronouns based on their appearance, their voice, their behaviors, anything that we sort of stereotypically put into the man bucket or the woman bucket. And so we'll see someone on the street or interact with someone and make a determination based on our own biases and preconceived notions about what that identity could look like. And then we use the pronouns that we associate with that gender identity. The challenge with that then, as we know that there are so many different ways people can express their gender, identify their gender, and some folks are transitioning in some way, shape, or form. And so if we are making assumptions about the pronouns that we're using for somebody based on these preconceived notions of what these identities can look like, we can then be wrong and misgender somebody. So misgendering is the term that we use to describe using the wrong name or the wrong pronouns, or otherwise misidentifying the gender identity of someone. And that is based on assumptions that we make. It could be an honest mistake and we're practicing and trying to use the right terminology, but our brain is still getting used to making those adjustments. But it's really important to be intentional about the words that we use, because it's a really important part of somebody's experience. Pronouns matter a lot, especially to transgender and non-binary individuals, because it is so aligned with their gender identity and their journey to find that full expression of themselves in their bodies and in the ways that they move through the world and their experiences. So if we're trying to really be allies and be supportive, then it's really, really important that we understand pronouns, that we are able to use our own, we're able to ask other people what their pronouns are, and we're able to use the pronouns that someone asks us to use for them. So I want to give some examples of what using pronouns inclusively can look like. There are many, many more contexts where this will come up. So this is not going to probably make you feel 100% confident in your abilities to understand and use pronouns, but hopefully it gives you a starting point. And my main message is to practice. That's the best way to get used to it, whether you're talking to somebody or interacting with someone or not. You could just be practicing with a friend at home or by yourself so that you get used to it. But practicing will help this all be more comfortable, and you'll just naturally get more used to it. And then it won't be an adjustment anymore. It will be easy to support people and use the right pronouns for them. So to start, it's a good practice to introduce yourself using your pronouns, because A, that helps show that you understand what pronouns are and why they're important. And B, you want to create a safe space for someone else to share their pronouns. Often, if you will say, my pronouns are she, her, that will show someone else, oh, I could probably share my pronouns because they share theirs with me. So there are a couple benefits to introducing yourself using your pronouns. Here are two examples of how you could do that. You could say, for example, my name is Kathleen and my pronouns are she, her, or she, her, hers. Or you could say, my name is Kathleen and I use she, her, hers pronouns. There are many different ways that you could introduce yourself, but the structure is usually she, her, hers, or she, her. Some will just say she. Same goes for he, him, his, they, them, theirs. So they, them, theirs, I should have mentioned before, is being used in a neutral context for many non-binary or trans individuals, anyone who falls within those umbrellas in some way. And we have typically used it in a plural context, so that's the trickiest one for people to get used to. But there are many contexts where we have used they, them, theirs in a singular form without realizing it. The example that always comes to mind for me is if I have like a package delivered at my house, I wouldn't say, oh, he dropped off the package earlier because I didn't see it happen. Maybe I just saw the package on my front steps. But I would more likely say, oh, they dropped the package off. So that's a context that I have noticed I used way before I knew what pronouns were and why they were important. That is a singular use of they, them, theirs. There are certainly many other examples of how we use that in a singular context. And many of the common dictionaries are now officially saying that that is a pronoun that you can use singularly. So I'll show an example of what that can look like in context, but I should have mentioned that before I started giving these examples. And like I said, typically the format is saying she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. But some people will use a combination. Some folks will want she, they pronouns, or he, they, or he, she, or all pronouns. Some people don't use pronouns at all. Some will use we if they are, if their native language is another language, or they're a fluent speaker of Spanish, for example, they might use a different term altogether. There are lots of different ways that people can define that, but if you are able to share your pronouns, then they can share theirs however they would like. So the next example is going to be how you can ask someone else's pronouns. Two quick examples are, what is your name and what pronouns do you use? If this is part of a normal introduction and you're saying like, this is me, who are you? You can ask what pronouns while you're asking what name, what their name is. Or you can just ask, what are your pronouns? If you want, you could say, may I ask what pronouns you use, or if you use pronouns. I would stay away from saying, what are your preferred pronouns? That used to be the more common terminology, asking someone's preferred pronouns, but we're not saying that anymore, because what that can do is make it seem like it's optional, like it's not important, it's just a preference, it's not a core part of who they are, or a major part of them expressing their identity. So it's better to say, what are your pronouns, than to say, what are your preferred pronouns? So avoid using preferred pronouns. That technology, or not technology, that terminology is now less accepted. So asking just, what are your pronouns, or what pronouns do you use, are generally good ways to go about it. So here's an example of the singular use of they, them, their pronouns. So you could say, this is James, they work with me. Whereas if James identified as a man and used he, him pronouns, you might say, this is James, he works with me. So you would align the verb with the typical way that you use they. So this is James, they work with me. Another example, how long have you been working with them? Rather than how long have you been working with him or with her. So those are a couple examples. Obviously, there are many, many more ways that this would come up, but I wanted to at least show you what that can look like in a sentence. And then the last example I want to show is how you can correct misused pronouns. If, for example, you know that one of your friends uses they, them pronouns, and you're talking to someone else and they use the incorrect pronouns. If you have permission from that friend to share that piece of information with somebody in order to help advocate for them, or just to make sure they're not being misgendered, then this is an example of how you could correct that in context. So for example, person one would say, how long have you known Stacy? She seems nice, making the assumption that because the individual's name is Stacy, that person then identifies as a woman, because Stacy we most often think of as a woman's name. And then the second person who knows Stacy says, I've known Stacy for 7 years and they're a great friend. Stacy uses they, them, their pronouns. So this is assuming that Stacy and this individual who is their friend have talked about this before, and Stacy has given permission for this friend to correct their pronouns if somebody misgenders them. And so it's generally best to use the correct pronouns in context, like in the sentence. So you're practicing, you're modeling using the right pronouns. And you can also be more explicit about what their pronouns are. But again, it's really important that you check in with that individual before you share that information, because as we'll talk about later, it's not always safe for somebody to be outed. That's a term for sharing part of somebody's identity without their permission, or without them sharing that. So it's important to get that permission first. If they don't give you that permission, you can at least ask them, you know, if I meet somebody or you come up in conversation, how would you like me to handle that? That way you're giving them the power to determine how you are an ally, rather than making assumptions and sharing information they may not want you to share about themselves. So then back to this example, the first person could say, oh, my mistake, thanks for telling me, or, I'll try to practice using that. There are lots of ways to respond. One important thing to keep in mind is if and when you accidentally misgender someone, use the wrong pronouns or the wrong name, which can happen, especially if it's new information, if you've known someone for a long time under one name and one set of pronouns, and you're trying to be supportive as they transition and use something different. Sometimes you can make a mistake. The best way that I have heard to handle that is to thank the person for correcting them and then practice and practice and practice and make sure you're using it correctly. I know for many of us, myself included, the instinct is to apologize because we feel bad that we made a mistake and we don't want to hurt somebody. And I think that's a great instinct to want to apologize for your mistakes. The reason that that is not advisable in this situation is that then puts the burden on the person who was misgendered, who was wronged in this scenario, to comfort you for making a mistake, rather than you taking ownership of the mistake that you made, thanking them for correcting you, which they didn't need to do. And it may have been difficult for them to do that depending on their relationship with you or where they're at in their journey. So being grateful for that correction and practicing on your own time to make sure you don't do it again is a better way to approach it than to apologize and put them in the position of feeling like they need to comfort you for something that you did wrong. So that can go across a lot of different ways that we can be allies based on different identities that we hold in other individuals, generally not begging for forgiveness and apologizing profusely and asking those people to comfort us for our mistakes is a good practice, and that applies in this context as well. So now we're going to shift and talk about sexuality and sexual orientation. There is a lot of overlap between gender identity, sex, and sexuality and sexual orientation, but it's important to talk about them separately as well so that you understand what that means. So I am defining this as who you are physically or sexually attracted to. It can also be connected to romantic attraction. Often there's overlap between romantic and sexual or physical attraction, but not always. So that's an important thing to understand. Much like gender identity, it is a way that we self-identify. It is not something someone else can define for us. No one else is in our brains or in our hearts or in our bodies and knowing what we feel and what we want. So it's always something that the individual defines for themselves. And also, like gender identity, there are a lot of different terms people can use for themselves. There's a lot of fluidity and room for variance. These terms can change over time as people learn and grow and have different experiences in their lives, as they realize the ways that they have been taught to be a certain way and try to shed those expectations to create their own journey. That can lead to changing the terms that you use as you figure that out. It can be a long process, and I have changed my sexual orientation, the identity that I use in the past, based on what felt more comfortable or the options that I realized were available to me. So it's important not to sort of pigeonhole somebody or put somebody in a certain box because that's what you knew of before, and then being rigid when they change that terminology. That's up to them. They're welcome to change it on a daily basis if they want. These are some of the most common terms you might come across. I'm not going to talk about what each of them means individually. If something is unfamiliar to you, I'd encourage you to do some research and check out what they can mean. Again, like I mentioned with gender identity, just be careful of your sources and make sure they are reputable or people sharing their own lived experiences and not others defining things either with malintent or incorrectly because they don't know and they're just guessing. So always check your sources. The only one that I'm going to talk about specifically is asexual, because that can be connected to what I mentioned before about romantic attraction and sexual attraction. So asexual is most often defined as someone who does not experience physical or sexual attraction. Certainly that can have some fluidity within that definition, but many people make the assumption that that means that asexual people are not interested in romantic relationships, whether those are monogamous or polyamorous or any of those options. But that's not the case for everybody. For some asexual folks, they want a romantic relationship. They just may not be as interested in the sexual side of that relationship, or maybe have some limited interest, but it would depend on the context, and overall are not interested in sex. It really depends on that individual. But I wanted to highlight asexual specifically because of that difference that I mentioned before between romantic and sexual attraction. Certainly there are asexual folks who don't have any interest in a romantic relationship, and that's perfectly fine as well. I want to talk specifically about the term queer because it is a really complicated term, and it's important that you understand the context of that and all the various facets to it so that you are careful with how you use it. So it is a term that has historically and currently been used in an oppressive fashion and discriminatory hate speech to speak in a negative manner about somebody based on either their identity or mannerisms, their perceived identity, stereotypes about what someone is supposed to be. But for many members of our community, this term is incredibly harmful, can be triggering, especially if they experienced a lot of bullying or abuse, or they were physically or emotionally harmed while that term was used. So not everyone in our community is comfortable with this term. So it can be really painful and problematic. There are also members of our community for whom this is an empowering term. So like many communities that have faced historical oppression and marginalization, there are terms that were used in the past to harm us, and we decide that we want to take that term back. And what that can look like is taking away the negative power of that word that has been used to oppress us and saying, this is ours now, we own it, and it's going to be empowering, and you can't use it against us. That happens in a lot of other communities as well. And for the LGBTQ plus community, queer is one of those terms that is in the process of being reclaimed. The trick there is that not everyone is supportive of it being reclaimed. So we have to be really careful with how we use it. I use this term to identify my own sexual orientation because I just feel more comfortable with it. And sometimes it's as simple as that. There's no specific definition of like, this is what queer means, and I therefore fit in this box. It's just the term that I prefer for myself. And I didn't used to use that term, but now I do. So I'm one of those people who likes the term queer and is reclaiming it. But I have to be really mindful because there are many members of our community who have strong negative feelings associated with this term for very valid reasons. So it's not a term that you can just use broadly to talk about our community or just sort of throw around like it doesn't matter if it's just another word. If you are not part of this community, if you don't identify as queer yourself, if you don't know that the people that you're talking to understand that complicated meaning of it and will understand why you use it and it won't harm them, then I would just avoid using it because it can be really challenging, and you don't want to unintentionally harm somebody by using a term that is offensive and pejorative for many people. You will sometimes see this term in academia. There's such thing as queer theory. You will also hear it in political contexts as part of movements to advocate for our community. But again, just be careful if you're just out in the world trying to be supportive to avoid using this term unless those very specific expectations or requirements that I mentioned are met, and you know for a fact that it will not be taken as a negative or in a derogatory manner. This is a resource I just wanted to share in case it's helpful for folks. It's a visual that was created to help explain the connections between identity, attraction, sex, expression, all the things that we've talked about so far. It is not the only visual that exists to represent that. There's also the gender unicorn, and there's some other visuals that were created to help understand it because they are also interconnected. They're not distinct things that aren't related to each other at all. They are very much connected. Who you are sexually attracted to, for example, has a lot to do with your own gender identity, the identities of the people that you are attracted to, the way that they express those identities or you express yours. Biology can also play a role in that. So there's a lot of connections between all of these terms, and it can be kind of confusing to understand how they connect to each other. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I wanted to put this resource out there, and the link is there. They have some toolkits, worksheets, and other resources for understanding this visual and maybe using it if you're teaching or if you're just trying to practice understanding it. So that's one thing that I would encourage you to check out. Again, the gender unicorn is another one that you can look at that goes through some similar information. So now we'll shift and talk a little bit about what coming out means. So we've gone over some basic terms. I've mentioned coming out or outing somebody in the context of misgendering or sharing someone's identity without their consent. But I want to make sure to talk about what coming out means. So October 11th is National Coming Out Day, but that doesn't mean that's the only day people come out. Coming out is the term used to describe someone sharing their sexual orientation or their gender identity or both with people in their circles or broadly. This is often an identity that we grapple with internally first and then decide whether and how we want to share that. So that process of sharing that information is called coming out. We can come out to ourselves in our minds, in our journals, in a lot of different ways. But most often when we say coming out, it's about sharing it with other people. So in many media, like TV shows, movies, books, things of that nature, we may see coming out as this like one moment that happens and it's dramatic and often doesn't go well. And either family members or friends or whoever is learning about someone's identity does not receive it well. And there are a few things wrong with that. One is that not everyone reacts negatively to someone coming out. Sometimes it's a really positive, beautiful, empowering experience. A lot of that depends on how supportive the individuals receiving that information are. But it can be a really empowering thing for someone to finally share this really important part of themselves, especially if they have grappled with it. And if it has been an emotional, challenging journey for them to get to that point, it can be an incredibly empowering, beautiful experience. It can also be really traumatic and painful if people are not accepting. But the other challenge with that typical representation of coming out is that it depicts it as this one event. And it happens however it happens and it's done. In reality, coming out is a never-ending process. If you think about it, every time you meet a new group of people, enter a new context, those new people don't know who you are, and you have to make a decision about whether you share this important part of yourself with them. And the answer will not always be, yes, I'm going to share this. It will depend on how safe you feel, sharing that information with people, whether it's relevant to what's happening. Maybe the risk of sharing it in a context where it's not necessarily relevant won't be beneficial. You don't know if it's going to be safe. You don't know if you're going to be accepted. And sometimes it might feel like I really need to come out and share this information because that's part of my journey and I need to be open about who I am. So it appears differently for everybody at different points in their time and their own journey over time. It can depend on the day. You can decide today, I just don't feel like it. I don't have the energy to deal with whatever like looks or reactions people will get or how they might treat me. So it really is an individual journey. And for example, I didn't need to share my identity with you today in this training, but I chose to because I hoped that it would be beneficial to give an example of how queer can be used as a term that people use to describe themselves, or how it can be an empowering term from my own perspective as someone who uses that term for myself. But I could have just as easily told you about the term, gone through all my information and moved on without sharing that context. But that was a decision that I made to share that information, to trust you, people on the internet that I don't know who you are or how you'll receive it. I decided that it was worthwhile in case it helps you better understand what that term means. But it's an individual journey and it should only be initiated by the person who is coming out or with their consent. So like we talked about with sharing pronouns or gender identity, it's best to get permission. There may be contexts where it will come up and you as a friend or an ally will want to be supportive and know the best way to refer to somebody, but that has to go through that individual first. They have to tell you exactly what they want to happen because that puts them in the driver's seat. And this is their experience, their journey, their identity. It is not something that any of the rest of us are able to share without that permission. So coming out is a really important process and it's highly variable depending on the individual. And it's a really good way to be an ally if you are the one receiving that information or if you're trying to be supportive for somebody who is coming out to other people. So I have a couple rhetorical questions here. Obviously, there's No one at this training at this moment, so I'm not going to ask for people to respond to it, but I just want to raise these questions to see if this would be beneficial or as you're thinking about your own journey in your own context. So the first is how do you respond if someone comes out to you? That can be a patient, a student, a teacher, a friend, a family member. There are lots of different ways that you can receive that information from somebody. So what would your reaction be if somebody shared that with you? And the second question I'd like you all to think about is, how do you create a safe environment for someone to come out? So for many people who are choosing whether or not to come out or how they're going to come out, the context can be really indicative of whether it's going to be safe or beneficial for you to share that information. And seeing different indicators like flags or somebody sharing their pronouns or just various things about the environment or your relationship with someone can be clues to how someone might react to that information. And regardless of what your relationship is with somebody and how much you love and trust them, there's still often going to be fear about how they're going to react because it's changing the way that they see you. So I want you to think about how you can create a safe environment or create supportive relationships that help build that foundation and that space for somebody to have a little more information and feel a little more comfortable that you will be supportive, because that can make a huge difference in whether or not somebody's willing to share that information with you. So these are a couple things to think about, how you would respond to somebody coming out and how you can create a safe environment for someone to do so. I'm trying to click. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectionality. It's an important topic, especially in this context, but in general, it's important to understand. And it's something that I talk about in every training that I do. So intersectionality represents the various identities that we hold as humans based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, religion, country of origin, first language, all kinds of different factors that interact to form us, combined with our lived experiences. And that can have an influence on how we move through the world and the opportunities we have, especially if we hold multiple identities that have historically been marginalized, oppressed, faced discrimination, or haven't been accepted. So as you have more of those identities that have faced those barriers, it can be even more complicated to navigate the world. The discrimination that you can face and the challenges that you can face will compound the more of those identities that you have. So why this is relevant to this context is that people who identify somewhere in the LGBTQ plus community, regardless of what term they use for themselves or how they express that, also hold other identities. They are not only their sexual orientation or their gender identity. There are also people with a race and ethnicity, a first language, a disability status, and those will impact their experiences. So for example, if there are two people and one of them is a white queer woman like myself, and the other is a Black queer woman, our experiences will be very different because of that racial identity that has been historically oppressed and marginalized. There will be more challenges that Black queer woman will face that I will not face as a white person, even though we share that queer woman part of our identities. And that's only a few identities that we can hold. There are many, many more. So intersectionality is critical to understanding all communities and all individuals, and especially those that already face some marginalization, like LGBTQ plus folks. And certainly even within our community, we have not always been very open and supportive of people who also identify as people of color or people with disabilities or trans and non-binary individuals even. Like all communities, we have hierarchies of privilege, and we are working internally always to try to figure out how do we do better, because those lines of privilege and oppression cross through all communities, regardless of what other marginalized identities we might hold. So just because I identify as a queer woman doesn't mean that I don't have biases and that I can't be racist. And it's my job to work to counteract those things and those narratives that I've been taught, those expectations and instincts. So it's really critical to understand intersectionality to know that not everyone within the LGBTQ plus community is going to have that same lived experience. And we have to treat each individual as an individual and understand that if you have more marginalized identities, you're going to have more barriers and challenges, and you might have faced more trauma. And so we have to be prepared to be humble and open and supportive, and let everyone take the lead in their own journey. And it can be a tricky thing to navigate at times, but it's a really important concept to understand. So I'm going to talk about some challenges that our community can face. The first one is discrimination in all aspects of life. That can be employment, housing, healthcare, and so on. And certainly if you're taking a systems look at everything, all of these different areas of our lives interact. If we aren't able to be employed because we identify as trans, or because of the way we express our gender, and people not being supportive of that, that limits the amount of money and resources that we have, which can impact our housing, whether we have safe, stable housing or not. It can impact whether we can get good health care and health insurance to pay for those healthcare costs. It can impact whether we're able to get an education or use the education that we received. It can also influence whether we get involved with the criminal justice system and many other aspects. So all of these factors and aspects of our lives interact with each other. So if you face discrimination in one or more of them, it could also influence your opportunities and your challenges in those other areas. And LGBTQ plus people still face a lot of barriers and discrimination in all of these areas, especially for people who identify as trans, non-binary, people of color, people with disabilities. Those barriers and forms of discrimination compound with that intersectional lens. So especially for trans women of color, there are so many barriers because of discrimination and the boxes that we require people to fit in to do certain things. And then when you look at all those marginalized identities that they might hold and the way society has tried to really push them down, it can be incredibly challenging to just live your life as you want to live it, which is what we all want to do, is be free to express ourselves and live our lives the way we choose, and that will make us feel happy and productive and healthy as we age, especially. So the biggest challenge that our community faces broadly, certainly with degrees, depending on our intersectional identities, is discrimination in all aspects of life. So this can mean limited opportunities for resources, for growth, for health, and it can then impact our outcomes, whether that's our long-term health, our educational opportunities, our earning potential as we age, because typically people earn more money the longer they work in a career or the more years that they work. But if you're having trouble finding a job because people won't hire you because you identify as trans, then it's going to be really hard for you to build a safety net, a financial support network as you grow older and need more support, because we all will need more support to some extent as we age. So there's short-term and long-term impacts on health if we face discrimination in any of these areas, especially in healthcare. Healthcare is a huge area for growth in terms of allyship, because many members of the LGBTQ plus community, especially trans and non-binary individuals, have faced discrimination in healthcare, do not feel safe receiving healthcare or approaching healthcare professionals. And health is everything. It impacts every aspect of our lives. But if we don't have good health, we can't work, we can't feed ourselves, we can't be safe and stable. Health can have such a drastic impact on our overall experience. So if you don't feel comfortable going to a physician or don't have the resources to receive the care that you need because of discrimination that you faced or discrimination that you expect to face, that's going to really impact you across the board in all aspects of your life. And many members of our community expect discrimination in healthcare settings. It's just a fact, and that's based on lived experience and what you've heard from members of the community. So it's important to understand those challenges. And if you have ways to interact with any of these systems and be supportive, it can really make a difference in other people's lives. Another challenge is many of us have limited social networks and familial support. So if you come out to your family and they reject you as a youth and kick you out, you are then on the streets trying to survive, which can then impact all those other areas of your life. And we all face challenges, things that just happen that we can't predict. And if we don't have a network to lean on or to get support from in times of hardship, it makes everything more challenging and puts us further behind in our own goals. So having those limited social networks and familial support can have a massive impact on someone's experience. And many members of the LGBTQ plus community have what's called chosen families. And those are friends and people that they've met who feel like family, because for many members of our community, they don't get support from their biological families or their families of origin. So we have to create our own. Some of us are lucky and privileged to have support from our birth families and from our community, but not everyone has that experience. So not having that support can have a massive impact on your experience. You could be socially isolated. As we've seen in the pandemic, social isolation can be hugely challenging and have a substantial impact on our health, on our well-being, on our productivity, on all sorts of aspects of our lives. So that compounds all the other challenges that people face, and members of the LGBTQ plus community have always faced a degree of social isolation. And as we age, it gets even harder as those chosen families shrink when people pass away or face discrimination and limited opportunities. It can get harder and harder to not be socially isolated and to have the support that you need. And like I mentioned, you can have fewer options for help in times of need, especially if your networks are also not privileged and don't have those resources. It can be really challenging to get support when you need it. So I want to talk about what allyship looks like as we start to wrap up. These are some ways that I define an ally. And an ally is basically someone who is trying to be supportive and advocate for people who hold more marginalized identities than they themselves hold. So this can be members of the LGBTQ plus community, and it can be non-LGBTQ plus individuals. So I, as a cisgender white woman, strive to be an ally for trans members of our community, non-binary folks, people of color, and other people for whom I hold a relatively privileged identity. So allyship can apply just as much to members of our community as it does to people who don't identify as part of our community. So when I think of an ally across the spectrum, I think of it as a title that we earn and not one that we claim. I would never call myself an ally if I wasn't doing the work. It's something that I'm always striving for and want to earn, but it's not something that I can just label myself as an ally and be satisfied. It requires some humility. You have to understand what privilege is. You have to understand that you're not always going to get it right, that you don't know everything, and that other people have a right to influence your life and the way that you express the terms that they would like you to use for themselves, for example. So you have to be open to that learning, and that requires humility. Being an ally is action-oriented. It requires doing things and not just being, because just being is not being an ally. It's existing the way that you've always existed. So ally implies action. It can evolve over time as you learn more and grow, learning about your own identities, learning about the experiences of others. It's important to expect an evolution and growth over time. It's also important to expect to be uncomfortable. If we're uncomfortable, that's where we can learn. And being an ally requires accepting that we are not perfect and that there are ways that we have wronged other people. And expecting that discomfort helps you be more prepared to take action and to change and grow so that you can be a better ally. It's important to recognize your own privilege and seek opportunities to learn. As an ally, it is your responsibility to take the lead in your own learning. It is not the responsibility of someone who identifies as LGBTQ plus to educate you. Some of us are willing to do that, and that's great, but that ultimately is your responsibility. And it's important to know when to step up and when to step back, when to be an advocate against microaggressions or supporting our rights in many different spaces, and when to take a step back and let people who identify as LGBTQ plus take the lead in sharing their own journeys and what they're looking for. And that can be a hard line to find. When do I step up and when do I step back? But that's part of the learning and growing, the expecting discomfort, and being humble so that you can just figure it out as you go. And here are some examples of inclusive language that you can use. On the left side are common terms that we have heard and use most often. They are all gendered terms, meaning they're attached to one gender in particular. And on the right are some more inclusive language. So it's always better to use a broader, more inclusive term rather than something that's specifically gendered, because it includes more of us. If you start broader and then someone says, oh, I'm a mother, then you can call them a mother. But if you start by calling them a parent, that includes more people who may not use that term for themselves. So I'm not going to go through all of these individually because we're out of time, but I want to share this resource as some examples of inclusive language that you can use. Certainly there are many more examples out there, and this is going to change over time. So then I have space for questions, but nobody's here. So if you have questions, feel free to check out Affirmation's website. You can contact me for more information. There are also many more resources online, some that I mentioned already, like the Genderbread Person and the Gender Unicorn. There are lots of great organizations in the community beyond Affirmations, the Ruth Ellis Center, LGBT Detroit, and others, SAGE, focusing on older adults. Those are all great organizations that also have resources and that you can support. There are many, many others. But I would encourage you to get some more information if that's what you're looking for. Thank you very much.